This is an interesting page because if you look at the pages before and after this, this is the town hose story. And this is the one time where there was this is the only thread through the entire project where there was a sense of visual consistency. I tend to, again, going back to that idea that, as I mentioned, I do not depend on art for an income or for a reputation or for validation. And so because of that, making art for me, again, is sometimes what might seem to be I pursue making art maybe the way a child might, with all the good and all the bad. And so at times, I realize I can be rather hyperactive and rather spastic in terms of the brevity of my attention span. And I knew starting out in this project that there was a danger of that as disciplined as I can be, that there was a possibility that I could find myself feeling smothered by the consistency of having to work on one illustration every single day. And so I tried to use some foresight and to build into my process as much freedom as I could, so that regardless of how I was feeling in terms of wanting or not wanting to make art that day, I would at least have some sort of incentive. Because by and large, I was especially at the beginning, I was very excited to do this, and it for the most part, I was always happy and excited to come home from work and to begin working on these illustrations for the book. But as with all of us, there were days when I was tired, there were days when I was ill, and then near the end, of course, the scope narrowed and things darkened, and it became quite something else entirely. But anyway, to try and combat what I knew would be some of the challenges, I gave myself the freedom to pursue any means of image making possible, any kind of representational style, any kind of media. And a part of this was because, as I think having read some of the interviews, I was thinking that this may very well be the last thing I did in terms of art. I had reached a stage in my life where I felt that maybe it was time for me to set. I told you my childhood, I felt, continued until I was 39 years old, and I thought maybe this is time for me to leave art in the realm of childhood and to become an adult. And so this was, in a sense, maybe my final exploration, my final challenge. And in using so many different kinds of media and investigating so many different representational styles, I was going back and touching on so many of the things that I had seen growing up and thinking that, well, I may never have a chance to use acrylic paint. I may never have a chance to explore some sort of hyper-representational symbolism. And so I allowed myself to do all of that because I thought this really could be the end. This could be a goodbye to all of that. So that was all a preamble for the fact that the town hose story is the one time through this entire project where there was a kind of consistency. And all of these images for the town hose story were executed on, as you noticed, color pages, and it was from a book on the history of shipping. The book was largely black and white, but it was more or less the history of mankind on the waves. And so the very earliest chapters went back to the some of the earliest Chinese sailors, 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and there were examples of their boats. And it was a rather pedantic and scholarly work, but it was profusely illustrated. And every 16 pages or so, there would be a suite of 4 glossy color pages, and most of these were period paintings. So for the town hose story, since it is a story within a story, since it is a narrative within a narrative, and it has this sort of specific, and to me, it always seems sort of vaguely historical, even within the context of Melville's novel. I decided that I was going to, for purely visual reasons, do all of those illustrations on these same glossy color pieces from that book on the history of shipping. So that is the mundane beginning of why you'll see a consistency through all of those images. If you look closely at them, you can tell they're all on a very similar kind of paper. Although I did spend quite a bit of time selecting those, looking for particular visual elements. And so you're right in that this piece was chosen because there is a sort of luminosity. There's definitely a beauty to that sky. There's something seemingly divine in the glow of those clouds and the lowness of the horizon. So that definitely appealed in terms of what I wanted to do with this particular piece. This piece goes back to a very, very vivid childhood memory. And this wasn't even a single time. I mean, this happened quite often. I was raised Catholic. And although my parents were not terribly strict, and I fortunately escaped that Catholic upbringing without an enormous burden of guilt, I still was raised in the Catholic Church with all of the pageantry and the symbolism and the ritual and the pomp that goes along with Catholic masses. But what was interesting is that the church that we attended was built in probably the 1950s. So the architecture was very modern. It was very much a brick sort of bunker-like box with some strange... I saw a church down here in Ohio that was very similar to the one that I went to. It had these sort of strange... It was almost like a... It's hard to describe this. From the outside, it looked like a brick clamshell, in that, the building sort of narrowed where the altar was, and then it spread out the way a clamshell would spread out, and the pews were arrayed in almost a delta or a triangle, all narrowing to the altar. And both within and without the church, there were these strange, there was like a ridge of bricks, 5 of them running up, spreading out almost like fingers on a hand from the altar over. So, the building itself, first of all, did not at all resemble a traditional Catholic church. It was very much an attempt, I think, maybe on the church's part to be modern, perhaps to attract more people. I really don't know. I can't imagine why such a bizarre and hideous structure was built in the first place. Within the church, though, it was even more astounding because, in the 50s and the 60s, there was this tremendous wave of, I think, civic pride. There was this huge attempt, and I know very little about art history, so I'm sure that someone that knows more than I do could explain to me in great detail what this was really about. But it seems to me that, if you go to any city in the United States, particularly in this area, especially, in the Midwest here, you will see, on the sides of buildings or in parks or things like that, these very modern-seeming statues and metal sculptures, metal structures on exterior library walls, showing sort of stylized, bizarre human figures that we do have one on the library where I work, and there are these sort of strange human figures with this metal sculpture, and I think it's funny, this shows how poor it is at communicating its ideas. I think it's supposed to represent the variety of cultures in the area, because all of these human figures have some strange differences, and they're human only in the barest sense that they have a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs, but they don't even remotely resemble human beings. So you had this big push, this big civic pride push, and I think that this idea that this was the era of modernism, that we didn't need these classical statues anymore. We didn't need this classical artwork. We could do something modern and interesting in these cities. So the church that I went to was very much an outgrowth of that, and on the inside, over the altar was this tremendous structure, this tremendous, not a crucifixion scene, but this bizarre gunmetal gray statue of Jesus with his arms outstretched and this bright silver and gold metallic halo work around his body and his head. And then both on the left wall and the right wall were similar but smaller statues of Joseph and Mary. And they were made, and they were such bizarre images because the form of Jesus, the folds of his robes, the details of his face, the religious symbolism had really been filtered through an almost science fictional lens, because I joke about this with people, and this is what I talk about when I talk about church, and everyone laughs, but it's actually very true. Jesus resembled a spaceship. And so I always called it Spaceship Jesus. But in a sense, to my young mind, I was born in 1969. I became aware of things in the 70s. That was the heyday of everything from, Eric von Daniken's idea of ancient astronauts, my father's heavy dose of science fiction reading, the Flash Gordon cartoons that were on the television. All of these things. It was such a bizarre time, and in a sense, my parents did bring a lot of counterculture elements into my childhood. I mean, they were good parents, but they were filthy hippies when they were in college prior to when I was born, and so there was a lot of that in my household. So anyway, all of this is a way of saying that to me, God and Jesus and the whole idea of divinity didn't have a whole lot to do with the practices of Catholicism or the catechism that I learned there, and had much more to do with the idea that I really thought God was alien.
And your hand of God, is a motherboard.
Exactly, see, and that's exactly what I'm saying. And I'm so glad that you noticed that, so that you see this benevolent hand, this colossal hand coming through the clouds. And of course, like you said, it's not so much the hand of my parents, but it was, and I'm glad that it comes through. It was very much intended to be this benevolent influence, this savior, of the ship, of the men on the ship. The hand is extended in kindness and in blessing, but a terrifying kindness because of the overwhelming size and strength. But it is absolutely drawing from all of those bizarre childhood perceptions that, God is an alien or a robot or something. And so when you combine that again with that fascination I had with these visual representations of scientific information, it became a kind of magic ritual. So for me, the magic of electronics, the magic of computer programming, the magic of being able to build and repair a transistor radio were inseparable in my mind from the magic of the Holy Communion, the magic of Christ's resurrection. All of these things became completely intertwined, and it all became whatever I did not understand, and there was a great deal of that. Whatever I did not understand simply became intertwined in my mind as magic, regardless of what it was, regardless of whether it was, I don't understand how this record player takes these vinyl discs and makes sounds. I don't understand how Jesus rose again after 3 days and rolled aside the rock from the tomb. It was the same to me. And to this day, and you can see, on my blog I have a bunch of my earlier drawings. This is very much an element of some of the very earliest drawings I made when I was 28, 29, 30 years old, and I had started to take drawing seriously. I think what I was really trying to do there, and I still haven't been able to do it, was try and work through some of my confusion at all of that. Because even now, those ideas hold a great deal of sway over me, but I know full well that they're, in a sense, rather foolish.
This is my favorite image, if I have to have a favorite. My favorite image in the book.
I'm very pleased, because it was always one that meant a great deal to me too, particularly because of that connection with my own life and my own struggles with religion and belief and divinity. And it was never one that seems to get a lot of attention anywhere else, and that's never why I did it. It wasn't as if I was fishing for online compliments on a blog or hoping that there would be a certain kind of response when I talk about the book in person. But there are a tiny handful of pieces that had a great significance to me, that it was always a little sad that they just didn't seem to have that same resonance with viewers. But that has been a strange thing from the very beginning, because I think that my sensibilities and my aesthetic are very out of step with what appears to be popular on the internet for the most part. And so often I'm a little perplexed at what seems to be, really appreciated on blogs and Tumblrs, when to me it just seems sometimes really banal or really obvious. So yeah, it's a mystery to me why sometimes I feel that there's a really direct connection with viewers, and sometimes I really feel like, I guess, I don't know, kind of sad that people just didn't seem to respond the way I did.